My colleague and friend of the last 15 years, Irene Garcia, is a tremendous journalist. She is an investigative reporter for Judicial Watch. She initially spent 13 years working for the Los Angeles Times, where she was part of two Pulitzer Prize award-winning teams in the 1990s covering the Northridge earthquake and the North Hollywood bank robbery. She took her journalistic credentials and decided to come back away from earthquake land and come back to Miami, Florida, where she works in our office there and runs our blog. So if you look at the Corruption Chronicles, which is Judicial Watch's blog, you will see Irene's work, where she does tremendous reporting and some opinion pieces that are full of all sorts of great wry, acerbic wit and commentary. So Irene is a great asset to us. And then to my immediate left, to your right, is, of course, Congressman Louis Gohmert, a Tea Party favorite, a six-term congressman from the House of Representatives. A man completely committed to restoring the Constitution. He's vice chair of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, which is very appropriate to our topic today. Formerly a district judge in Smith County, Texas, and Chief Justice of the 12th Court of Appeals in Texas. He's a Texas A&M graduate, Baylor Law School graduate, and I'm also proud to say, like myself, a former U.S. Army officer. Next to him, of course, is a man who I admire greatly. In this town, there's a lot of people that talk about things. This gentleman has put his money where his mouth is in his professional career, and he has put bad guys in jail away forever, and that's a great thing. Mr. Andrew McCarthy, a best-selling author and contributing editor at National Review, is a former chief assistant U.S. attorney in New York. He is best known for leading the prosecution against the Blind Sheikh and 11 other jihadists for waging war against the United States through jihad. And of course, the 1993 World Trade Center case that all of you, I'm quite certain, are familiar with. Mr. McCarthy also supervised the U.S. Attorney's command post near Ground Zero immediately after 9/11 and served as an advisor to the Secretary of Defense. A tremendous author, well-known commentator, Mr. Andrew McCarthy.
Thank you.
And just past my colleague Irene is another one of my colleagues at Judicial Watch, Mr. Robert Popper. Bob Popper is a senior attorney and director of our Election Integrity Project. He's a former deputy chief of the Voting Rights Section, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. He heads up our Election Integrity Project. Mr. Popper, besides being a wonderful human being, is an incredibly knowledgeable person regarding all things with respect to voting rights and election integrity. He served as counsel on a number of constitutional challenges alleging racial segregation in the design of New York's congressional districts and successfully defended that appeal in the U.S. Supreme Court. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Northwestern University Law School, Bob Popper. And then last but certainly not least, is J. Christian Adams. Mr. Adams, of course, is president and general counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation. Also, another man with tremendous experience and knowledge with respect to voting rights and election integrity. He served from 2005 to 2010 in the voting section at the U.S. Department of Justice. He's a legal editor of PJ Media, published widely, National Review, Washington Times, Breitbart, Washington Examiner, all the great publications I know that you read. He's a best-selling author, of course, and he possesses a law degree from the University of South Carolina Law School. So that's our lineup, and it's a mouthful, and it's a ton. Just a ton of experience and knowledge, and we're going to jump straight to questions because our topic generally today is illegal immigration, the illegal immigration crisis. And within that crisis, there are a number of sort of subtopics, namely national security issues, job security, election integrity, and public safety. So just a few things to touch on, right? A very narrow topic. But there's a lot of stuff for us to cover. And so I'm going to slide from my podium here to the chair. And Mr. Gohmert's going to be my first victim. Not too long ago, at the end of July, I was out at the Aspen Security Forum up on Mount Olympus with all the great minds gathered to discuss national security issues. And Jay Johnson was talking to us about all sorts of homeland security topics. And it's very interesting to me that in the
He
course
knew something about him.
one or two things, so he alleges. But one of the things that Mr. Johnson said, besides that ISIS was not Islamic, was that he avoided discussing the fact that in the last 2 years, Homeland Security has released over 60,000 convicted criminals into the United States, of whom at least 2,000 were violent crimes against persons, murder, rape, assault, all those sorts of things. He somehow managed to miss discussing that. I heard you on the radio. I was in Phoenix last week driving around, and I heard you substituting for our good friend Sean Hannity. And I know that you're connected to the frustration and the aggravation that the American people feel with respect to immigration issues. I know you're completely plugged into it. I also know that a lot of your leadership, unfortunately, doesn't feel the way that you do. And so maybe as sort of a kickoff question, the American public feels at threat and at risk. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you view that from your position as the vice chair of your subcommittee.
Well, first of all, the reason many of the American public feel somewhat at risk because of this issue is because they are at risk. That's why they feel it. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And, all right, since you picked on me as your first victim, I got to say, I've been looking at Judicial Watch and the slogan. That's not the slogan that really reflects Judicial Watch. It should say, Judicial Watch, doing justice because the Justice Department won't.
Sadly true.
And so I can't overestimate how much gratitude I have for Judicial Watch.
Thank you.
And a little plug, I'm not getting paid. I can't get paid by anybody. That's the rules. But if it weren't for Judicial Watch, we would really have nothing but an empty server in Congress. And people are not realizing, they're thinking the Benghazi Committee is getting down to the truth, and it's the different batches of emails Judicial Watch has gotten. When you hear about some emails, if they have anything helpful in them, then they're the ones Judicial Watch got. So just so you know, and in fact, Trey Gowdy Boehner couldn't pick a better guy to charge of that committee, but the speaker picked, as I understand, all of his staff, if not all, and Trey didn't even know that they were not getting the emails that Judicial Watch was getting until Tom Fitton called me, and I went to Trey directly, and he changed that, but that was just in the last few months. So thank God for Judicial Watch. Now, when it comes to this issue, and I'm not going to get a chance to respond to my dear friend Judge Napolitano, but I've heard him say before on television that anyone born in America is an American citizen. That's just the way it is. End of story. Apparently he's not familiar with the fact that Senator Howard, that drafted the 14th Amendment, said these words: "This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens, who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government of the United States, but will include every other class of persons." And so I know my friend the judge says, if you're born here, you're an American citizen, and that also is not accurate. If you're the child of a diplomat born here, you're not an American citizen. So we got that part of Howard's statement correct, but we need to finish getting the rest of it correct. In the meantime, as a former district judge, felony judge in Texas, I can tell you American citizens are at risk every day to people that should not be here if the United States government were taking their job seriously. And when Arizona tried to enforce the federal law because the feds were not, they should not have been stopped. The law is the law. And normally, if you're a federal law enforcement officer and you see somebody violating the state law, you can go ahead and step up and arrest them. So this is a new thing really in law enforcement, but Texas is doing what it can, but under the restraint of the Supreme Court. Right. Even though they've put all those people up on the border, that helps restrain some from crossing. It doesn't prevent people that are wanting to come into America from coming in, but the coyotes that are putting them in their raft and bringing them across don't want to get caught, because if they're caught, their raft is destroyed, and then they may lose their life when the drug cartel leader that is in charge of that area of the border gets hold of them. So they do anything to avoid getting caught. I've had some guys in the state of Texas DPS boats that say they have gone under the boat and around the motor trying not to get caught. They'll do anything. So it could be stopped if they were willing. On one of my times down there's a park you've probably seen on television. It's a U.S. park right across the Rio Grande from the Mexican park. And people will pay guys on jet skis to run them across. I've seen it happen 4 times. Each time they get across, a constable goes up and arrests them. And I grabbed one of the constable, and I said, nobody's more pleased than I am that, you know, you're getting these guys and turning them over to our Border Patrol, but, you know, after the Arizona decision, how are you doing that? And they said, this guy said, did you pay $4 to get in the park? And I said, yeah. He said, they didn't. They're trespassing. I arrest them and then turn them over. So they're doing what they can. But I'm telling you, I had one guy in particular who had 9 DWIs and was never deported. And he finally hit somebody while drunk and driving and didn't kill him, fortunately, but serious injury. So they're in my court he is in my court as a felon. And I've seen they hadn't been willing to deport him. And one of my jobs is to protect society. So I maxed him out, sent him to prison. And 6 months later, he's in my court for another case. And I had to use the interpreter because he didn't speak any English at all. And I said, how did you get back here? I sent you to prison. I maxed you out. He said that he was in prison for 90 days, and then the federal authorities decided to deport him, and he waited until they drove off, and then he crossed right back in. Come right back in. And so that time I locked him up for 10 months in a drying out program, and that time it took 4 or 5 months before they deported him. I don't know where he is. I'm sure he's in America somewhere, and America's at risk. If you feel you're at risk from people illegally in the country who are criminals, you are. And you've got to stay on the lookout and report them. The feds aren't doing their job, but your local law enforcement will do everything they can using state law and local law to lock them up if you'll let them know. So Homeland Security says if you see something, say something, but not really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like the Russians said, we're seeing Tsarnaev has been radicalized, and so the CIA did nothing. So they tell the FBI, we're seeing he's been radicalized, so do something. They did nothing, and we had a Boston bombing as a result. I said to the FBI director, you didn't even go to their mosque. You know what they did? They interviewed Tsarnaev, and he said, I'm not a radical. They interviewed his mother, and she said, he's a good boy, he's not a radical. And they said, okay. I said, you didn't even go to their mosque and talk to them, you know, ask other people. Is he reading Qutb? The guy that wrote Milestones, Osama bin Laden said radicalized him. You ask, and I didn't hear the very last phrase. My staff told me after the hearing, it said, we did go to that mosque. And I didn't hear he added in our outreach program. They didn't even go to ask about Sarnia. They went out there to have a meal and talk and touchy-feely stuff. But then I said, well, did you even know that the mosque was started by Alamoudi? And he looked flushed. He said, no. Alamoudi, he knows the name because he didn't originally gather the evidence. The British did, but they failed to do their job on Alamoudi, and the British provided the case. He's doing 23 years in prison for terrorism, but he started the mosque that the Sarnievs attended. I tell you all that and I'll shut up, but you are at risk. So you've got to keep your eyes open because your safety may just depend on you.
And that is the perfect segue for Andrew because you have done the right thing and you have put bad guys away. And, we're in a position now where there's been an announcement from the White House about the bringing additional Syrians into the country. And it's my contention, and please elaborate, we don't even know who is in the country now. We have no real clear understanding of who's present. And of those that are present, whether they cross the border, southern border, or whether they're visa overstays, which are frankly even larger than the southern border crossers, there are people operating in the United States who are, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other affiliates, operatives embedded here. And if you could talk about some of your experience in prosecuting the case and then bring that to the present, if you could.
Sure. It's not just a question of their being in the country where we don't have the kinds of checks that we need. We don't also, the inputs into the system, we have no way of vetting people who want to come here in the first place. I mean,
Right.
are we going to go to Assad and ask him which ones
Exactly.
it's okay to let in? We have a rich history, particularly in terrorism, of people not really smuggling their way into the country. There's small incidents of that, but what a lot of people don't recognize is that about 40% of illegal immigration doesn't come across the borders by smuggling. They're visa overstays. And there are also people who exploit our refugee programs and our other immigration programs. So, for example, in the Blind Sheikh case, the Blind Sheikh was in the United States. This was a comedy of errors. We had one office of the Immigration Service that was trying to kick him out of the country while the other one was trying to keep him in. Neither one knew what the other was doing. And it turned out that by the time they both got on the same page and realized he was somebody we wanted to boot out of the country, they had already given him a green card as a religious worker. We had a couple of guys who actually built the World Trade Center bomb who were in here on a vestige of Simpson-Mazzoli, the Immigration Act from the 1986 case. They were driving taxi cabs in Brooklyn as, of course, agricultural workers. And the only
Everyone knows that.
the only hands they ever got on fertilizer was to build bombs. So that's how well that all worked out. Right. I think a lot of, if you look at the terrorists who've been prosecuted, it's only a small percentage of them who've actually come in over the borders. They're mainly visa overstays, and that's mainly because we don't track people once they're here. And going back to what you began with about why should people feel threatened, I think there's two legal explanations for it. There's a variety of cultural and other explanations as well. But the main legal explanation, and the reason that this goes off the tracks in the first place, is that when the country was founded, the idea, as far as the Constitution is concerned, was that Congress was going to set the conditions for naturalization.
Right.
It was not given an enforcement role. And for the first century plus in the history of the country, the questionable thing was whether there was any federal role in immigration enforcement. It was mainly like every other internal matter, it was supposed to be a state enforcement thing. And the idea with immigration, like with everything else, is that the people who were closest to the problem would come up with the most sensible solutions to it, rather than a one-size-fits-all thing prescribed by people who are totally detached from it in Washington. And as inevitably happens when you allow over time the courts in Washington to rewrite the way we live, what's now happened is what was a state responsibility has become not only a federal, not only is there a federal role in it, it's now deemed by the courts to be an exclusive province of the federal government. And the problem with that is if you're going to give over to Washington the entirety of discretion over immigration enforcement, and then you get an administration that is committed not to enforcing or to not enforcing the immigration laws, then the states are completely stuck. They're not allowed to protect themselves. And the people that they look to, because they have to protect them in Washington, refuse to enforce the laws. So, obviously, if you feel threatened by that, you should feel threatened by that. The other piece of this that I think needs to be mentioned is this idea of prosecutorial discretion, which the Obama administration has perverted across the board as far as the president's duty under the Constitution to faithfully execute the laws is concerned, but particularly with respect to immigration. Prosecutorial discretion, up until President Obama took office, was just a very simple resource allocation doctrine that essentially said, we cannot, nor would we want to live in a country where you enforce every single crime. So you have finite criminal justice resources and you want to target them at the most serious problems. And this is the important point. When a prosecutor says, I'm going to go after the heroin traffickers, not the marijuana users, because I only have so many DEA agents and that's the best use of the public's funds, that's not the prosecutor saying, I'm therefore now making marijuana use legal. It's simply saying, some laws demand enforcement attention more than others do. And what President Obama has done is use, under the rubric of prosecutorial discretion, basically he is repealing immigration laws that have been enacted by Congress by virtue of not enforcing them. So it's no longer that he's saying, look, this is bad conduct, but there's worse conduct over here and we have to train our criminal resources on it. He's saying, we're forgiving these violations. And as a result, we're not going to enforce them. And what you end up getting is a greater and greater expanse of criminal activity that is not only not enforced, but is basically dumped on the states in addition to every other pathology that comes with immigration enforcement. So Washington won't enforce the laws, and then they say to the states, you people handle it. You educate them. You make sure people are fed. You make sure they have a roof over their head. You make sure they get hospitalization when they need it, and let us know how that works out for you. So should people feel threatened? They should absolutely feel threatened, but they should also know where the threat is coming from. It's not necessarily just the illegal immigration. It's the government in Washington.
And on the overstay issue, how many of the 9/11 hijackers were overstays? That was the biggest
If
issue.
I remember, it
was several.
15, 16?
The 19.
19.
Yep. So Irene, I know that you do a lot of your own reporting on this subject, but you also do interviews on it. You're interviewed as an expert on these various topics, and our own editorial work where we come up with records and documents and produce them. Very often I see and hear, and we've had conversations where the illegal immigration question is reduced to the race card. You're just a hater, that's all it is. Yeah. And there's an attempt to disconnect conduct and behavior with sort of racial status. And I know that's a point of frustration for you because we've discussed it.
Yes.
So if you could, talk to me a little bit about your experience, because you deal with this from two ends. You conduct your investigations, you write your stories, but you also answer very often, even in Spanish media,
Yes.
the claim that somehow this is just bad people playing a race card and,
Right,
being
right.
mean.
Yeah, immediately the race card is played. I do a lot of interviews, Spanish language with Univision, with Telemundo, with the And that stunt that Jorge Ramos, the main anchor of Univision, recently pulled that when he was interviewing Trump, I mean, they're advocates, the Spanish language media in this country, and they're not to be taken for granted. They're very powerful. They reach hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Immediately, the race card, and they tell me, they accuse me of being racist because we want the laws enforced, because we're opposed to having illegal immigrants in this country that have no documentation, that are repeated state crime offenders, yet get released into the general population. We've seen it. We just uncovered records in San Francisco. Judicial Watch uncovered records, the illegal immigrant, multiple offender that killed the nun in a drunk driving accident. So they say those are the exceptions, that we're racist. And one of the things I always point out, of course, is that there's still, and it's something that gets lost in all this coverage in the left-wing media, is that a legal process to come to this country still exists.
Right.
Not everyone that wants to can come, but that process still exists.
And what's the message to those persons who are pursuing the immigration process lawfully, who have tried to play by the rules? And what's the impact of this turning a blind eye?
Right, if you're rewarding the rule breakers, and everyone who has kids know that, if you're going to reward bad behavior, then what's that going to do? You're going to get more bad behavior. And if you're punishing those who are following the rules, then of course, and that's certainly the message that's being sent. And one of the things with the media coverage is that the race card is just too quick to be played immediately over everything. And they are definitely playing it in this, and a lot of the mainstream media too, the English language media, the race thing. And we see it. We have an office in South Florida, and the school, my kids go to public school, and I hear from the teachers all the time. We now have to absorb all these kids, the unaccompanied alien children that came. By last count, 64,000, Congressman, you probably know better. Mm-hmm. And these school districts, a lot of them have been redeployed to places like Florida, so far from the border, yet, and these teachers are complaining that some of these kids are not literate in their own language, so that now they're 11, 12, 13, and they're illiterate. So now they have 3 years to get them up to speed. So these are the smaller issues that we're not really getting a lot of media coverage on. And they're not all just little kids. There's also been a lot of gangbangers. Judicial Watch uncovered that story a year ago, and now recently the Texas Department of Safety confirmed it, that they were using Red Cross phones at these shelters to communicate with gangs, with like the MS-13 and these major gangs that have been recruiting these kids. So this is all part of such a much broader thing. So to use the umbrella of racism is not fair, but certainly it's being played, and that's just not fair and not right, and we have to try to counter that. And I do that as much as I can with the Spanish media, because they do kind of classify everyone who's for rules and the law, the rule of law, when it comes to immigration, as racist.
Another step along the way is sort of the social fabric, and we've talked about criminality and enforcement of laws and the consequences in the community when it comes to schools even. The next thing that comes to mind, of course, and our expertise on this panel has to do with elections, right? So voting in elections and what's the consequences, what's the impact with respect to illegal immigration? So Bob, my question to you is, what are the odds that non-citizens vote in U.S. elections?
Well, it's absolutely certain. They do. There have been prosecutions in Ohio. I think there was a Bosnian voter in Michigan. There have been prosecutions in Iowa. There were, I think, 19 voters identified in a recent Philadelphia election who were non-citizens, and some of them had been identified as having voted in several elections over the course of many years. But if you look at voter fraud, you know that prosecutions are not the way to measure that. Many jurisdictions, we've learned, do not even keep track of voter fraud cases. Many don't prosecute it. For many, it's not worth prosecuting because the penalties are so small. And in many cases where you need specific intent, all that's required is for someone who voted illegally to say, I didn't know, and the prosecution goes away. The way to approach the extent of illegal voting in the United States, or voting by non-citizens, is by a study. And for my money, the atom bomb of all studies on non-citizen voting was released last year by a sociologist from Old Dominion University named Jesse Richmond and his team. And what they did was they took a database that was publicly available that has been weighted to represent the United States at large. And it involves a huge sample, something like 50,000 one year, 30,000 the next year. And it's immensely valuable because in that study, they don't screen for citizenship. They ask you, are you a citizen? And then they separately ask, and have you voted? The results that he obtained were that in approximately 14% of non-citizens, lawfully present and unlawfully present, are registered to vote. In 2008, 6.4% voted, and in 2010, 2.2% voted. Now, the 6.4% means 1.2 million votes.
That's an astronomical number.
Wow.
That is an astronomical number.
Wow.
It is, and 2.2% is 400,000 votes. And John Husted in Ohio, Secretary of State, has done extremely valuable studies documenting how in Ohio, this is more of a side point, but they've identified 63 elections in the past 2 years that were decided by a single vote or by tiebreak procedure in Ohio.
Wow.
You know, and we know of senatorial races where they've been decided by hundreds of votes. You know, 1.2 million, now you're talking real numbers. The same authors estimate, they don't know, and they don't make this allegation, and they can't, but they estimate that the margin of illegal voting was enough to put North Carolina in Obama's column, was enough to account for one congressman to the United States Congress and one senator. It was enough to do that. Whether it did that, we don't know. And there's, you know, this is a peer-reviewed article. There's been no response to this except by way of blogging. There have been no peer-reviewed responses. Some professors have blogged about it. And what they initially said, and I mean, I suppose you have to say something, and what they said was, well, the percentage who actually filled out this form who were non-citizens was so small, it was 1% typically in the samples, that we don't know how many of them filled that part out wrong and filled it out erroneously. Now, I was in touch with Mr. Richmond last week, the author of the study. He told me that there's an update. In 2012, the numbers are similar to the prior numbers. And in 2012, he indicated that he had 80% verification that those who filled out the form and said they were non-citizens in one of the prior years filled it out again and said they were non-citizens. Now, you can fill it out accidentally once. It is unlikely that you filled it out accidentally twice.
Right.
He also said that what they've decided to do is increase the extent to which they verify the votes. What that means is that they go and they find that these people did vote. They find their names, they find the vote. So the votes now are verified. This study is just, it should be mind-blowing. That many illegal votes are floating around. And we know how those votes skew.
Sure.
They skew overwhelmingly Democratic. You know, so are our elections our own anymore? I mean, we have to ask that. The effect is convincing, and I think the documentation is only going to grow.
Thank you, Bob.
Well,
Sure, sure.
people would believe that about Texas, but it's so amazing when it's Ohio and
Yeah.
in the middle of the night down on the border with Border Patrol, they'll when the supervisors aren't around, they'll tell you more than they will
Indeed.
Otherwise. But one of the guys there, 2:30 in the morning, said, you know what the drug cartels and the gangs call us? Know what? Logistics. Logistics? He said, yeah, like the commercial. Their motto, the drug cartels, and the drug cartels hire gangs to bring people in. Anyway, he said, they say, we bring them across the border and Homeland Security is our logistics. They ship them where they want to go.
Sure.
It's
Absolutely.
incredible, but it's true.
Yeah, Border
That's
Patrol-
why you have,
Border Patrol agents now spend more time giving folks Greyhound bus tickets and $200 stipends and moving them away from the border than they do any sort
It's
of
incredible,
enforcement.
incredible.
Christian, there's an environment where this takes place, right? This doesn't just magically happen. There's our illustrious Justice Department and the embedded institutional left that has occupied positions within the Justice Department. And I'm not exaggerating, you know far better than anybody else, that there's this sort of cultural environment of people who are really political operatives entrenched. And regardless of what administration comes or goes, they're there doing what they do. What's the impact on immigration enforcement from your experience and position?
Well, immigration enforcement is shut down for all intents and purposes. But Chris, you said something very important, and that is, in trying to understand the immigration issue and how it relates to elections, I think you only understand the immigration issue because of elections. It's elections in the long run that this is all about. And it's far worse, and as bad as it is, it's far worse than we've heard here. This isn't about stealing an election or two over the last couple of years. That's not the worst of it, is a theft of elections. The worst is the long game that the institutional left always plays, and that's to change the electorate. It's not about stealing a couple of elections here and there. This is about changing what America is. It's about altering the electorate. For example, in Texas, I did a story where there was 2,993 murders in the last couple of years committed by aliens in Texas. That's a horrible byproduct. What's really happening is they're changing Texas. If Texas goes, the country goes. You cannot win an electoral college majority for conservative constitutionalists without Texas. If you lose Texas, it's lights out. And so what's happening in Texas, we heard about Florida and the schools there, Florida, North Carolina. This is about changing the electorate. And that's why the institutional left is all hands on deck, not about a couple of elections here and there to steal, but to win them legitimately in 15 or 20 years. Not to steal elections, but to win them by altering the atmosphere, the rules of the game, the people who vote, how they vote. And so you need to understand the whole immigration fight through that lens, because the Soros-funded organizations, the hacks at the Justice Department that Bob and I used to work with, some of whom actually go to work for Soros after they leave the Justice Department, a woman named Julie Fernandez. If you've read my book, you know who she is. These people are in it for the long game. They're not trying to steal a school board race. And so you need to understand the immigration lens through that. The Justice Department, though, has become a fully integrated arm of the DNC. They enforce, like Andy was talking about, Bob and I worked on what's called motor voter, cleaning up the voter rolls. It's a federal obligation. Well, when Julie Fernandez, who now works for George Soros, became the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Bob and I sat in a room where she shut down enforcement of this law. She announced it to us that this law was not going to be enforced to make sure non-citizens weren't on the rolls, to make sure that dead people weren't on the rolls, and so forth. It's because they don't like election integrity. So you need to look at the immigration issue as a long game election issue. It's about those anchor babies. It's about bringing people who are used to a culture of corruption into the country from Guatemala and Nicaragua. It's not about race. It's about experiences. And they're used to governments who don't function, and they put up with it. They're used to a different experience culturally than American folks are from Peoria. And so that's what the immigration issue is all about, and that's why you see a lawlessness that's so pervasive in this administration that is going to outlast this administration. Look, if Ted Cruz or Donald Trump were president of the United States and did nothing about where Bob and I used to work, never lorded over them at the voting section, those folks would do the most radical left-wing stuff they could. And even if those folks are elected president, it's going to take constant vigilance to deal with these swarms of bureaucrats that fill this city, to do what Soros wants them to do.
Right.
And so I don't have a lot of happy news, except you all need to be vigilant. And the work that Judicial Watch is doing on this, and frankly, the people on this stage, Steve Bannon, John Funds here, I could count about 50 people who have really put the line up against this crowd And you guys are really a strong part of that too.
Thank you
Chris?
very much, Christian.
Would you say he's fundamentally transforming America then?
You know, you got to take people at their word. History has told us.
Yeah.
When they tell you what they're going to do before they get into power, you take them seriously, because that's the story of the 20th century.
Yeah, he's delivered and then some. So now we turn to you. This is an opportunity for you to ask this panel the questions that you may have. We have 2 microphones set up. So those of you that would be interested in asking a question, I don't think you're going to find a more knowledgeable cast of characters up here who have really tremendous insights. And so we'll alternate back and forth. If there's an opportunity, if we need to move a microphone, I'd ask that somebody help out if we need to assist somebody getting a microphone. We'll go back and forth. We'll do some questions. If you would kindly tell us, firstly, who you are, and then if you need to direct your question to somebody in particular, that would be helpful as well. So we'll start over here to my left, this lady here at the microphone.
But please be gentle.
You can take it.
My name is Barbara Dello, and it could be to anybody. I don't know if, but my question is, can you explain the purpose and benefits of the legal immigration process? There are many soft-hearted people who wonder why it shouldn't be like the time of the Pilgrims, that people can just come to our shores. Can you better explain to America the reason for and the benefits to the country of the legal immigration process?
Thank you very much. Everyone want to step up to that one?
Well, I tell you, the founders knew by 1789, I mean, there was some of that feeling in those early days of the country too, but by 1789, when the Constitution was actually ratified, 1787 when our Constitution was actually drafted, they realized, you know what, as so many of them talked about, this is something that philosophers have only dreamed of, a people actually governing themselves. And they all talked about, well, as Jefferson said, eternal vigilance. But they understood. That's why they put a provision in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress would be in charge of naturalization. You would need that process, because it isn't just about, as the French statute that was sent over here says, send us everybody. We needed to be vigilant. Right before a big surrender, they sent it. But we would need to be vigilant, because if you, like Franklin said, it's a republic, if you can keep it. Because they understood that the forces of nature would work against what they put in the Constitution. So it's not just about bringing everybody here, as many as we can. I bet everybody here welcomes immigration at some level, because it's good. Fresh water flowing in, the new DNA, new genes, it's great. Increase the gene pool here in America, it's great. But they have to be trained and educated to understand that with these rights are responsibilities that are even more important than in order to keep those rights. People say, but we're all endowed by our Creator. Well, an endowment is an inheritance. And like anything that you inherited or that's left to you, you can keep it, but you've got to be willing to fight for it, because if you're not willing to fight for it, there will always be evil interests, power-hungry people that want to take it away. So that's why we should welcome immigration, but it has to be controlled. We give out more visas than any country in the world. We have about a fifth of the population of China, maybe 3 or 4 times less than India, but we give more visas to more people than any of those countries, because we're caring people. But we have got to be vigilant, and we've dropped the ball. And the administration's been telling us, we've had hearings on this, look, we are detaining fewer and fewer people at our border, so it's good news. There must be fewer and fewer coming in. I'm going, well, that's like the sheriff in our county, murder's up, but he's out there saying, well, murder's down because we're arresting fewer murderers these days. That's not a good indication, and I know, I hope you'll be able to explain to people that ask that question. Sure, we care. And some say, well, as a Christian, and this is a real big problem for some Christians. As a Christian, we're supposed to love and welcome the foreigner. Yeah, individually, we're supposed to live up to the Beatitudes. But if you're part of the government, which everybody in America is, you serve on juries, you vote, you're the CEOs, you're the board of directors. You get to decide who you're going to hire to be your servant. So you're part of the government. When you're part of the government, then Romans 13 kicks in. If you do evil, be afraid, because God doesn't give the sword to the government in vain. You are supposed to be vigilant in making sure the laws get enforced, and that means if people break the immigration laws, I am so, so sorry. But we're going to have to treat you like Mr. Ellis did when on opening day of the swimming pool in Mount Pleasant, Texas. If you cut in line, he would make you wait till everybody that was coming that day got in first, and he cut that out.
He's over here. Yes, sir.
My name's Jim Whitman. I'm a friend of Judicial Watch from Florida. Congressman Gohmert, I love your footwear. I do have a question as a Floridian with regard to election integrity. That doesn't really have anything to do with immigration. Oh, well, there's a non-endangered bird species called the snowbird. They come from Massachusetts and New Hampshire and New York, and there are probably 2 million of them at least, and they come down to Florida in the winter. I wonder if you can comment on, or if you know anything about the possibility, if 5% of those people voted in 2 states, that's 100,000 people, 100,000 votes.
Sure.
So I'm just curious about that.
I refer to South Florida as the 6th borough, being a native New Yorker. But Irene, when you're there, you live there, and of course, Bob and Christian, any kind of numbers, any kind of even anecdotal stories of New Yorkers or anybody else winging their way down.
There's a Maryland version of the snowbird called the Windy Rosen. Windy Rosen, some of you, I think I saw heads nodding, was the Democrat nominee for Congress in Maryland. She won the nomination, but she was also registered to vote in Florida and was voting. Wow. Voted for Obama proudly, said so to the media, but here's the best part of the story. That's a federal felony. When you vote for president twice, and I mercilessly went after the U.S. Attorney and Eric Holder month after month after month, where's the Wendy Rosen prosecution? There was no Wendy Rosen prosecution. In fact, she was prosecuted by a state official in Maryland, got a slap on the wrist, never saw the inside of a jail cell, and then after she pled, said how glad she was that she broke the law because she supports President Obama. That's the world we live in now, where the Justice Department lets Democrats vote for president twice.
Excellent example.
I
Perfect.
also have some
yes, go ahead.
statistics from a case from Virginia where there was litigation over their cross-check system. And what this is a system whereby voter registrations are checked with other participating states. It's voluntary. And at the time, there were 26 states involved, so it's not even a complete sample. And the 26 states did not include Texas, California, and New York. So it's a rather limited sample. And in that limited sample, they discovered that something like 50,000 Virginians, just Virginians, were registered in 2 states, 16,000 in 3 states, and it went up to numbers who were registered in as many as 7 states. Now, you can't say that it's fraud. I mean, I think people just leave one place and go to another, but sometimes it is fraud, and sometimes people take advantage of it. But, I would say large numbers of people are probably registered in several states. Yes?
Well, and it points to a short...
Which is another organization which I highly recommend, True the Vote.
Yeah, they're good.
They're good
doing
friends
a
of ours
great
and
job.
clients of ours.
But
so
it
that-
points to another problem that Republicans have. You know, there's some groups of voters that we just figure, well, they're going to vote, you know, nearly 100% Democrat, so why even try?
Well,
But-
maybe if you guys would give us someone that we would want to vote for
Well, I
twice.
know. Well, yeah. Well, you know how I feel. Andy, I love Andy. He's one of the few people that answers my emails at 4 in the morning. But no, I think one of those groups of voters that we should go after, the dead vote. We don't get any of the dead vote, and there's no reason that they shouldn't be voting Republican too.
I think you're supposed to say vitally challenged.
Yes, ma'am.
Vitally challenged.
Vitally challenged.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, it's my turn. I'm Ramona Brandt. I live in Virginia. The program is called Illegal Immigration, but I've recently found out about the Refugee Resettlement Act.
Right.
1980, Kennedy, Biden, Carter. I mean, this is a big secret in our country. We're concerned about these illegals coming across the southern border, but we're bringing people in who are given rights
You got it.
immediately. They can vote. They don't have to speak English, but there's so much being hidden about this. Ann Corcoran, if you're not familiar with this book, but why aren't we talking about this more?
Well, you're,
And now we are, which is
Yeah,
a great question. Thank you. Go ahead.
you're quite right about the exploitation of legal means to come to the United States and then overstay is something that, to my mind, is as big or bigger a problem than the invasion over the borders. And what's truly frightening is that a lot of what you're talking about now specifically is an act of Congress, right?
Yes.
President Obama has asserted, and evidently this is the next big push in this area that the administration is going to make, that he has executive authority under the Constitution to parole into the United States whoever and however many people he wants to. So, you know, all this stuff you're hearing in the news about, you know, is it going to be 1,000 or 1,500 or 10,000
Oh, these
people
are
from
hundreds
Syria?
of thousands who
Yes.
have already come in.
Right.
Yeah,
And,
and
they're
and
being
there's a
brought in
cottage
by
industry.
voluntary churches, church groups.
Right, and they're
But they're being paid billions of dollars by our government.
Well, but and I agree with all that. My point is that at least with legislation, even dopey legislation, it has to get to the finish line. There's a debate on it, there's a vote on it. We now have a chief executive who thinks he doesn't need legislation. He can just
Doesn't care.
proceed by fiat. And let me just say one other thing about that, because this cuts across the board. It's not just immigration. President Obama is what he is. He's a known quantity. He won't
That's right.
enforce the laws, and that is what it is. It's not gonna change. But the problem in the country is that you have a constitution that is built on the premise of separated powers on the theory that they will compete with each other if one oversteps its boundaries and overreaches. And it's just as much of a dereliction of duty to be the loyal opposition that doesn't oppose as it is to be the president who overreaches.
true,
Right.
very true.
But I just want to say
Well,
that,
if you, I
but
know,
already the people
you're
who have
asking
come
about
in-
the refugee program, and yes, it's an act of Congress that was signed by the president. But like Andy said, the president's totally ignoring the law, and that's what his unconstitutional illegal amnesties have been doing. He had, this last amnesty, he didn't even sign an executive order. He pronounced it like any good monarch would, and then Jay Johnson wrote it out as memos, and that's the amnesty. And thank goodness, our speaker, you'll remember before and after the election both, he said, we're going to fight this illegal unconstitutional amnesty tooth and nail. And oh yeah, we forgot to fight tooth and nail. But anyway, some of us fought tooth and nail, and I'm
Okay, but
being
I can't blame
sarcastic.
Obama for
But
this.
some of us have been fighting this very problem, and we haven't had the leadership that will back up what they have said with what we need to do. And just before I left to come over here, I saw a story on Fox News of the refugees in the Middle East. And I didn't see anything but desperate women and children. And we got this report of the 381,412 arrivals by sea in 2015 of these poor refugees. 72% are men.
Yes,
And
yes,
that-
with babies.
So, you know, even our beloved Fox News is playing into
Yes.
this thing and making people feel like we've got to welcome these refugees when the best thing we could do for them is help them relocate to a Muslim country like Saudi Arabia. They got the money, they got the wherewithal, and that's where our focus ought to be. But I'm telling you, it's not in the Bible, but it is every bit as true. Democracy ensures a people are governed no better than they deserve.
Right.
As a nation, we deserve Barack Obama not once but twice. But I'm telling you, when enough people make enough noise, we've been able to stop the disastrous border bill that Boehner had come up with in July of last year. That was all stopped because people burned up the phone lines. People make a difference. But those of us that are constantly fussing at our own Republican conferences in Congress, unless there are people burning up the phone lines to the other members, it doesn't do any good.
Let's go
So
over here
keep
for-
fussing, please.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes. My name is John Kunstadter, and I have two questions. First, would anybody on the panel like to give a de facto definition of American citizenship now and going forward? Not what's in the Constitution and the laws, but what it really means anymore to talk about citizenship in this country. And Mr. McCarthy, would you be willing to
You're the wordsmith.
Estimate whether the blind sheikh or any of the other people you convicted on that crime or any other terrorists who are in prison will not be pardoned by this administration?
Two great questions. Thank you.
That's a great question.
On the pardon, I think there are going to be massive pardons by the time this is all said and done, because the pardon power is something that's unreviewable. The president's already talked about using the pardon power to reverse some aspects of the federal narcotics laws that he doesn't like. I've been arguing probably for over 18 months that I thought he would ultimately pardon the illegal aliens in the United States. Now, a lot of people think that won't work on the theory that, you know, every day you're here, it's a new crime. But there are ways. First of all, you should know there are ways to do programmatic pardons. For example, Lincoln and Carter used the pardon power to Carter with respect to Vietnam draft evaders, Lincoln with respect to the Confederacy issued mass pardons during their administration. So for the people who don't think that can happen, it can happen. And I believe it can happen in connection with immigration and related crimes, and there are a ton of related identity theft type crimes that get committed in conjunction with immigration. And the dangerous thing about that from our perspective is, in the eyes of the law, when you're pardoned, it is as if the underlying crime never happened. So if we take that doctrine seriously, there will be a lot of pressure on the federal courts to decree that people who've been pardoned, who are in this country, there shouldn't be a impediment to them becoming American citizens on a fast track.
Voting, which gets back to Christian's point.
Yes, sir.
Peter Knickerbocker with Let Freedom Ring. To the four lawyers on the panel, and part of my question I think was partially answered. If the next administration was disposed to take action, what is the criminal liability of the political appointees, or even lesser, that are carrying out these various illegal programs, including perhaps issuing counterfeit work permits that have no basis in law and so forth? And if there is substantial criminal liability over hundreds or thousands of current federal employees, can we expect to see a massive preemptive pardon before this administration leaves office?
And before anyone answers, just fair warning, you'll be the last question for this session, unfortunately. We'll all be around for lunch and can talk afterwards, but I don't want to have people staying for no reason at all. So if you would answer this gentleman's question, and then you, ma'am, you'll be the last question for this session.
I can say very quickly, it depends on who we elect and whether or not people demand that the law be enforced and people be prosecuted. I have a great fear that even a staunch Republican will feel, George W. Bush, I like him, he's smarter than people gave him credit for, but he's a nice guy. And when he came in, there would have been crimes committed, and his approach was basically, bygones, we're starting fresh today, we're moving forward, and if we have a president that does that, we're done. We have got to have somebody come in and immediately just take the blinders and the chokehold off of the Justice Department and say, sick 'em. And otherwise, I don't think we're going to see any of it.
Assuming we get that kind of president, what is the criminal liability?
Well, Christian's been in there.
I got to tell you, that ain't going to happen. We work with people at the voting section. Front page of the Washington Times, they were stealing laptops. They were using their government credit card to go see their mistress in Miami. Okay, front page of the Washington Times.
Justice Department?
Justice Department. Running the housing testing program, going into apartments to see if they racially discriminate. That person got a buyout. Got five-figure buyout from the federal government, no criminal charges. We have another person who committed perjury in the scope of an Inspector General report, in the Inspector General report, in the voting section of the Justice Department, still employed today.
Wow.
We have a woman named Carla Dubinsky in the criminal section who set up New Orleans police officers. It's a complicated story. I've covered it at PJ Media, but she set up New Orleans police officers for criminal conviction out of the Criminal Civil Rights Division. A federal court in New Orleans spanked her, scolded her, called her out, still employed at the Justice Department as a GS 1510, $157,000 a year, about 5 blocks from here. So nothing happens. The whole federal bureaucracy exists to preserve itself. You're just not going to see it.
But we
Completely
have got
theoretical.
to start. That we've
Yes.
got to start.
Mr. McCarthy, completely theoretical. If we had the equivalent of a Truth and Justice Commission, that came down on this, and what is the theoretical criminal liability?
Well, it would be hard to say because there are a lot of immunities involved if what you're doing as a government official is within the scope of what you're supposed to be doing.
How about the
Now,
Anti-Deficiency
but
Act?
for someone who's admitted to perjury,
Yeah.
the situation is different. And, other people leaked internal documents to their friends at the Washington Post. I mean, they're definitely, there's that sort of decision. But if you're making a decision pursuant to an order of the president and it's colorable, then you have very few options to prosecute.
Well, you get an indication from Congress itself. I got a bill, I thought it'd be the best approach on sanctuary cities to make individual office holders individually liable. And I've got a few co-sponsors, but most people are afraid that will make them look too harsh. But the way to get office holders' attention on sanctuary cities, I thought, is let them have some individual liability. We're talking about fines and liability in court to victims, and not even talking criminal. And I still have had a lot of trouble getting people to sign on.
Well, all this kind of stuff is fine, and I think we should explore it. The Justice Department's budget today is about $28 billion. It goes up every year. It's on cruise control. If you continue to pay for a Justice Department that is a net negative as far as national security and domestic enforcement is concerned, if, for example, you continue to pay for the Justice Department to do affirmative litigation against the police departments of every big city in the United States, and then the police are paralyzed because if they don't assimilate to Obama-approved policing, they have to feel like they're facing, professional problems, civil liability, criminal liability, as Christian just said, in New Orleans and other places. we have a Justice Department now that, as far as, and I say this as somebody who couldn't be prouder of my time in the Justice Department, we have a Justice Department that is a net negative for justice. And it's not just, we're not talking about speculation now. This is having real consequences. Read what Heather McDonald has an op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal. Have a look at the statistics about homicide across the United States. It's up like 76% in Milwaukee, over 50% in St. Louis, up major numbers in big cities across the country.
We're up against
It's because the police will not enforce the law because the Justice Department has intimidated them. So it's not, this is on the ground policing is not being done because of this Justice Department, and yet every year Congress gives it the same amount of money with a little bump even higher.
We're up
You're the
against a
first
very
to
hard
call that
break,
what
so I
it
need to
was.
get this question. We'll try to answer it quickly. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. My name is Arlene Smith, and my question is about the health issue with immigrants. In the late 40s, my baby brother managed to survive his first few months struggling through whooping cough. And I know that we've had TB pop up and even a pocket of the plague recently. This past week, I noticed both on television and a commercial that's running and in print, in an advertisement, the warnings to parents that whooping cough is like Little Red Riding Hood's wolf.
Sure, we've seen that.
And it occurred to me, I thought, when my children were born in the early 60s, it was I don't know when it began, but at least by then it was a regular thing that the doctor would give them inoculation. So I don't think they're talking to most of us. I think this is to warn people who are not from this country and not familiar with our health standards. So the big question, I think, is anyone addressing the health impact from tuberculosis, measles, all these things where people are maybe afraid to go to the doctor or because of the culture are not aware of what they should do?
Sure. and
Well,
I
some
can-
of us have asked those questions, and they've denied that there is any relationship at all between the diseases popping up around the country where they're sending people. They've denied any relationship. So that is you nailed it. I mean, it was not a problem until we had this mass influx. And I've been down on the border, and I've asked a physician down there when they had 1,000 people in a holding area, and I said, are you screening these people for these important critical diseases? And she said, well, yeah. I said, but isn't the inoculation, it takes a while for it to show itself. They're shipping them out before it has any chance to manifest itself.
And
so it's a huge problem.
One last comment is we've obtained records from the Center for Disease Control where we've seen their internal emails discussing these unaccompanied children that came into the country. And the comments from the managers within CDC is that the president's judgment on this is he's out of control. And their internal turmoil, not just trying to figure out what language to use to call these unaccompanied alien minors, but their own sense of frustration and being overwhelmed. It was a public health crisis then, and it's one now, and it's not getting better necessarily. I have to end there. I want to thank my panel here for coming in and talking to us, and thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.